Private sector, probably. Why spend your time at the local level if you can be making a lot more in some kind of either corporate or other setting? Additionally, if we're thinking about proper response and investigation when it comes to different types of digital evidence, it costs thousands and thousands of dollars to get all the site licenses, equipment, and materials necessary to actually perform a good analysis. Does anybody know how much it costs to get a site license for NCASE or FTK?
A ton of money.
A lot of money, right? We're talking in the thousands of dollars just for one license of NCASE. So to stand up a good cybercrime or computer crime unit is going to cost a significant amount of money. Where do you think state and local agencies are going to pour most of their resources? Is it going to be on the computer crime side or on the street crime side?
We're on drugs.
Street crime, probably. That's a reasonable idea, right? Yeah, we know drugs are a significant problem, right? Everybody's concerned about that. So, this is where we run into some hurdles. So if we don't have the resources to support proper investigation, we don't have staff that are going to hang around long enough, we also have this big challenge of a lack of support at the management level. For those of you in the private sector, how often do you run into that challenge of trying to communicate things up the ladder?
All the time.
All the time. The same thing happens within policing. Someone might see and understand an issue, but in trying to communicate it to officers who've been working in law enforcement for 20, 30 years, they might not understand the value of computer crime. They might be thinking more in terms of the latest Law and Order or some of the more unusual things that you can catch on TV about what is computer crime. And the limited amount of empirical evidence that we have, in other words, researchers who've gone out into the community and actually surveyed state and local law enforcement agencies, most of what happens appears to be related to either child porn cases, threatening communications, or cyber stalking. And what is cyber stalking? Does anybody know?
Facebook bad.
A hookup gone bad. Well, if you're on Adult Friend Finder and something bad happens to you, I'm sorry, that might just be your own problem. With regard to cyber stalking, this could be any kind of communication that makes a reasonable person, and that's an important definition legally, the reasonable person feel a sense of fear or concern for their personal safety over what they're receiving. So, by and large, most agencies are looking at either some type of sex crime involving juveniles or adults. And when we push this out at a higher level, most of the research that's been done has looked at certain states, like Michigan or, to a lesser extent, Georgia. When we push this out to the national level, the last time anything reasonable was conducted was in 1999, and it was published in 2001 by Stambaugh and a few other researchers. And this was published by the National Institute of Justice. It's this big document, and it basically assesses the entire capacity of a survey of agencies in terms of their ability to respond to computer crime. They use a very comprehensive definition for both electronic crime, they don't refer to it as computer crime, and also one for electronic terrorism. And in looking at these agencies, they provide a variety of steps that have to take place in order to improve the response. Generally speaking, this document says we're not doing enough at the state and local level. Computer crime or electronic crime is something that we don't have our hands around deeply enough. And so they talk about the need for public awareness campaigns pushed out both to law enforcement and the general community. If you were to talk to somebody who's never been to a hacker conference before, do you think they'd even know what happens here? When I talk to people and I say I go to hacker conferences, you'd think their jaws would hit the floor. We don't talk about burglary conferences or anything like that.
They think it's wrong.
Right, they think of the criminal element of it. And so to educate people about the variety of things that happen would help us quite a bit. How many of you in some kind of private sector setting have significant issues with email responses to dumb messages that people just fall for? This morning before I left Michigan, I got an email in my MSU account that said, hey, we need you to enter your credentials so we can verify your email account. Within 2 hours, a message went out to the entire campus saying, uh-oh, don't respond to this message.
Too late.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, too late. So public awareness is needed, not only for our law enforcement agencies, but for the general population. Also, we need better reporting and better data of computer crime. So how many of you know the primary resource that we have to investigate and understand the frequency and prevalence of real-world crimes like robbery and burglary? Where do we go? Anybody?
I think Microsoft calls it coffee.
We would go to something called the Uniform Crime Report. The Uniform Crime Report is put out by the FBI every year. It's aggregated statistics about every crime that is reported to a law enforcement agency. Within that data, there is nothing related to computer crime at all. We have no idea. There's something called the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS, and that has some data in it about computer crime. But the likelihood of us having NIBRS data that would tell us about computer crime is probably a decade or more away. So for us to have any demonstrable understanding of what happens within each city, within each state, is very, very low. Also, any CISSPs or any certified individuals in the audience? They encourage the notion of developing certifications and uniform training for law enforcement agencies. So that way we don't have individuals with unique or unusual training. Everybody's got some consistent pattern. Additionally, let's create some task forces or distinctive electronic crimes units at the state and local level. Does anybody know of a city here in North Carolina that has such a unit?
Charlotte?
Charlotte, correct. Charlotte has its own digital crimes unit, and that was stood up within the last couple of years. So this is a relatively recent innovation. We also need updated laws at the federal and the state level. Why do we need that? If it's not illegal, is it a crime? Not really. How many of you heard about the Lori Drew case, the woman who, the young woman who hung herself as a consequence of mean messages on MySpace? Remember that?
Yeah.
What law was she prosecuted under? Does anybody know?
The user end agreement thing.
The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is designed to prosecute computer hacking, not the creation of a false MySpace profile. So they had to stretch it to say that she violated the end user agreements provided by MySpace by creating a fictitious persona. That's not very helpful. We need better laws, and this is just one example of why. Also, they talk about the need for greater cooperation with the high-tech industry. In other words, we need people who are at these Symantec's, the Microsofts, etc., working with our state and local folks so they know what's happening. Special research and publications. In other words, individuals who are out there in the research community like myself saying, here's what you should be concerned about. Here's where you need to be pushing your resources as it relates to computer crime. Also, management's got to get built in and bought in. Yeah?
Are you aware of any already ongoing cooperation with high-tech industry?
Generally speaking, there's not a lot, although in states that have a significant presence in terms of, say, the financial sector or the computing sectors generally, so like in Charlotte, there are individuals at the local level who do have some connections with Microsoft and with the Secret Service. So there are those partnerships there. InfraGard is also a good metric by which we might assess these growing relationships. Yeah?
That was my comment, InfraGard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, InfraGard is a great step. It's something that combines all these different entities together. So there are, again, steps that are being made to push these things forward. But it's not 100%. We're not at a perfect kind of place yet. Better forensic tools and investigative resources are also needed. Yes?
Talking about police management support, one of the things I've heard from various forensics investigators is if they wanted to get a job with the police department, the police have a very much you have to be a beat cop first attitude in order to get into doing computer forensics investigation, which is tangentially related, but very much a different discipline.
Sure, and that's very true. But that does appear to be one of the ideas that's promulgated within the law enforcement community, is that you're not going to investigate these offenses without understanding the general climate with which you're going to have to work. So if you're a first responder, we want you to be able to go to a scene where there's a computer or a body or whatever in order to know what you're going to do effectively. And that does add a layer of complication. If you want good folks who are going to do their job, do you want them to have to work for 5 years as a beat cop, or do you want to be able to push them onto the job as quickly as possible? And then that raises questions for management about, do we invest thousands of dollars for this person, Or do we take somebody who's had some experience and push them into these roles? There's a lot of complexity that takes place. Law enforcement agencies are really difficult animals to work with. And so for us as either criminal justice practitioners or for you all as individuals working in computer security or otherwise, it's good to know what the climate is that you're working within. So if we don't have a lot of understanding of what's happening, if we don't know exactly what the current climate for state and local law enforcement agencies look like, then we need to better examine this problem. So what I'm going to present to you today is going to be sort of like a greatest hits compilation of a variety of different research projects that we have ongoing. Some of which touches on national level issues, some of which will touch on issues here in North Carolina, and then another one that taps into kind of a broader dynamic of digital forensic examination. If you get bored, fire away with questions. I don't want anybody falling asleep. It's too early for that right now. So let me talk about the first thing that we have. So we have a nationally representative sample of law enforcement agencies operating at the state or the local level. So we collected this with an agency called the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, or FLETC, which is centered out of Georgia. And they provide computer crime training, digital forensics training for law enforcement agencies across the country. Working with them, we were able to get 437 individuals within different agencies to respond to a survey. This was out of a database of 10,000 individuals, though. So what's that mean?
Less than 5%.
Pretty low response rate, which is relatively disappointing. This was with significant cooperation on FLETC's part. So this is nothing against FLETC or with our respondents, it's just one of those things. Less than 5% is pretty low. What does that tell us? Well, this is not a generalizable sample, but it gives us something to work with. This is a convenient sample of agencies. So we asked them a lot of different questions as it relates to computer crime, cybercrime, their investigative capacity, what their agency looks like in terms of training and otherwise. So this first slide is just kind of a general demographic description of what we have. In terms of the size of agencies, different places with more than 5,000 officers comprise a very small percentage of what we're looking at. So these are relatively small state and local agencies. Most of it's clustered right around the 20 or less or 200 or less agencies. And in terms of population served, most of our agencies are operating at between 5,000 and 20,000 people served. So these are smaller agencies overall. What does that tell you at a practical level? Is that good, bad, otherwise? Are most places major cities with millions and millions of people? No, not really. I mean, if you think about major states, or any state really, there's going to be a couple of population hubs, and then there's going to be a lot of outlying areas. So this touches on some of those agencies that fall into the outlying areas. Let's get to some of the meatier issues here. When you think about agencies and officer training, one of the things that's been pushed out in the last couple of years is the importance of officers having 2 or 4-year degrees. Why would we want law enforcement officers who have college degrees?
They aren't as mean.
They might not be as mean. What else?
They have they're more committed and they have like a higher intelligence. I wouldn't want to say that, but
They might have a diversity of knowledge that might not otherwise come from someone with just a high school background or perhaps a military background. So within our sample, 78% of the agencies had less than 20 officers with either a 2 or a 4-year degree. So this is an okay statistic, generally speaking. It's not great, but it's a good start. Also, we asked about how many officers they had that actually dealt with digital evidence. We tried to carve out to some degree whether they look at computer forensic issues, computer crime issues, online crime investigations. And most agencies had 1 or 2 full-time people assigned to handling digital evidence. So 40%. 42% had no one full-time. So there's a mix here. We have both full-time officers and we have some places with part-time. So not every agency has their own unique person. In terms of officer training, we asked within a certain percentile, how many of your officers have received training as it relates to either digital evidence or online crime? And online crime is everything from sex offenses to hacking. And so looking here at the 10% level, this is where most everybody falls. Less than 10% of officers have received experience in either digital evidence handling or online crime. With digital evidence handling, if you were to walk up onto a scene where there's been a homicide or otherwise, if that person has a PDA or a cell phone, or perhaps they have an iPod, is that technically digital evidence that might apply to the case?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. How do you deal with that? How do you have officers who know what is supposed to happen? That's a relatively interesting point. This suggests that maybe we need to improve our capacity at the state and local level in terms of officer training and awareness. We also asked at a broad level, what types of computer crimes do you investigate? So fraud, harassment, and identity theft comprise the greatest proportion of investigations. So we're talking about financial crimes and to a lesser extent, individuals who receive some kind of threatening or unfortunate personal email or otherwise. Child porn cases, solicitation of children comprise the next greatest. And then at a practical level, sex crimes, this could be prostitution, escorts, whatever, are 42%. The lowest come in with hacking and intrusion. Why do you think that might be?
I think part of that is that if it's a federal investigation, you have to prove $25,000 in losses before they'll touch it. The second part is, I think it's just a harder investigation to follow.
Good.
They want the low-hanging fruit.
Absolutely. That's a very reasonable response if you think about it.
I think you. I was going to say most of the people get hacked, like a large majority using WAP, or they don't know what they're doing on a computer security-wise. They don't even know that it happened to them.
Okay.
And the only thing they do is antivirus software.
That's a reasonable issue too. Agencies may or may not know. Businesses might not know. Yes, sir.
So I think you also have the issue of where did the crime actually happen?
Good.
So if I break into it, if I throw a rock through your storefront, the cops where that store is are going to do the investigation. If I hack into Coca-Cola, Wake Forest PD isn't going to investigate that.
Right. If you think about it, one of the bigger cases here in North Carolina involved a hacker in Michigan who was compromising a major hardware retailer, if you think of it that way. So the international dynamics and the cross-state dynamics make the jurisdictional issues here very complicated. So state and local agencies aren't necessarily going to have the appropriate response capability. Yeah?
Many businesses don't want to admit they got pwned.
That's another issue too. What do we do about the agencies that aren't even going to report this, whether it's to the FBI or otherwise? So at an investigative level, most of what's happening is related to financial crimes or sex crimes. Hacking and intrusion, much, much less. Yeah?
Do you have any statistics, or did they include any in the survey about how many resulted in successful prosecutions? Because I see the identity theft, but that seems like that might be difficult to investigate for that skill level.
That's a very good point. Yes, we do have some data in here about active cases and cases that are cleared by arrest. And so cleared by arrest is sort of a final solution wherein somebody has either been arrested and prosecuted, or at least a suspect was identified and a subpoena was issued. So this is a good starting point. As it relates to digital evidence, we see that most agencies are in our 0 category, followed by 3 to 5. So when we look at a broad level, between 3 and 5 cases and 6 and 19 cases, this is where most agencies are going to fall. So there are some degree of digital evidence cases that are active. Yes, sir, you and Beth.
I'm with the South Carolina ISAC. We show at 1,600 cases so far this year.
Good, so that's pretty heavy.
Most of those botnet.
Good, now that's a very wonderful thing. At a practical level, this is just, again, a sample of national agencies, or at least a nationally, hopefully, representative sample. So this is limited to certain places. There are some states that are much better than others. Yeah?
I wanted to get a qualification on that. Was that actually each person that had gotten hacked, or was it that you had done that many botnets?
That's 1,600 cases involving anywhere from 1 to 3,000 computers.
Okay.
So good, so those are individual distinct reports.
Those are individual investigative cases.
Good, good. When it comes to online crimes, so this is where we might be talking about botnets, we might be talking about child porn, whatever the case might be. The majority come in at 0 cases. So 27% of our responding agencies, almost 28%, say they have 0 active cases related to online crime. Again, the modal and relatively significant appears to be maybe up to 6 to 19 cases overall. Cases cleared by arrest, the numbers are much more significant. We see relatively few cases that are either digital evidence related or online crime related that lead to a cleared by arrest outcome. Yes?
So that tells me you're more likely to get away with it?
Good point. Would we get away with it at the state and local level? Potentially. We don't
You're
know.
more likely.
There's some likelihood, yes. We would at least say there's something distinctive about the difference between active and cleared by arrest. And so at the 0 level, yeah, that's a bad sign. But generally speaking, when it comes to the anonymity and the privacy afforded by some of the technologies, you can get away with a federal crime even. But at the state and local level, this again appears to be a significant issue. We also asked the individual respondents to give us some of their perceptions about computer crime. And so we broke it down into certain statements and then asked how much do they agree or disagree with what is provided. First and foremost, computer crime is a serious problem in American society. Thankfully, most all of our respondents agreed with this, 98%. But in terms of computer crimes detract officers' attention away from street crimes. So in other words, this street versus cyber dynamic. There's some disagreement, but there's also a pretty healthy amount of agreement. So what does that mean at a practical level? Within a law enforcement agency, there is some research to suggest that there are subcultural dynamics at play. In other words, within a law enforcement agency, you're going to be a headbuster, you're going to be a problem solver, you're going to be a helper. Are you going to be helping anybody investigating a crime where there might not be a cleared by arrest, where there might not be a suspect that we can tag? And so how might that be affecting the perception of computer crime within a law enforcement agency? Also, we asked how many citizens in the community understand the risk of computer crime. Most everybody disagreed with that. So, in other words, we might get it to some degree, but the population that we serve does not. We also asked about the issue of cyber terrorism. So, attacks on computer systems pose a threat equal to or greater than physical attacks. Most individuals agree. Yes?
I was wondering about that if it was based more off of what they've seen in movies where terrorists have gotten control, like the Die Hard movie. Like if people see that and then they're like, oh my God, the terrorists are going to do all this, instead of something like I don't think I've never seen anything where they can actually do that because most of that stuff is in a closed system. Hopefully.
Very good point. How many of you have seen Die Hard 4, just out of curiosity? With Kevin Smith as Uber hacker living in his mom's basement? Unfortunately, yeah, that does play into some individual perceptions. We asked a control about this a little bit later on in the survey, and I'll touch on that in just a minute. But yeah, that might have some prospective effect. I was once interviewed by a French documentarian who said, so is Die Hard 4 really going to happen? No, unfortunately, we're not going to have a fire sale. How many of you have heard that term, by the way? Outside of Die Hard 4? Fire sale? Good stuff. Good stuff. So, yeah, that might have some impact. We also asked some perceptual questions about individual offenders. So this issue here, the majority of computer crimes are perpetrated by individuals in their teens and 20s. So in other words, younger individuals engage in these behaviors. There's mixed response here. Just out of curiosity, what's the modal category for offending as a whole? Street crimes, that is. Are most people going to be younger or older? Younger. Crime is by and large a younger person's game when you look at the demographic components of this. When we think about computer crime, some of that might apply here. Some of that might be why we're seeing this kind of variation. We also asked how many computer criminals often reside in foreign countries. So in other words, offenders are living abroad. There's a mixed response here. And that might be a function of the fact that there is some mixture of attackers that engage in different behaviors. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just another question that's important. We also asked about the recognition that computers have a unique dynamic, different from the street. So we provided the statement, computers allow individuals to feel less responsible for their actions, thereby increasing the likelihood of crime. 92% of the individuals agreed with that. Anybody ever heard the term Deindividuation before?
How about deface?
Web defacement, sure. What's Deindividuation mean? Those three of you that raised your hands. Anybody know? Yeah.
It's like taking a person and not seeing them as a person, seeing them as just something out there.
Mhm.
So you're not humanizing them. They do it a lot in the military, actually. You know, for,
Yeah.
like, soldiers. You don't want to like know the person you're shooting, so
Exactly.
dehumanize them.
Within a virtual environment, we might be able to say that who cares who you're email blasting? You don't know who that person is. You're not going to watch their response.
Referring to me as a Facebook user is an example of that.
Good, good. So if you're a Facebook user, can I just post some inane, mean comment when you post, hey, I'm having a great day? Yeah, go suck it, or something like that. There's a guy who's a friend of mine on Facebook who every day that I post something good has something very negative to say.
I'm going to do that now.
That's
I'm going to.
Thanks, guys. Great. Blast away.
Right now. I'm doing it now.
Hooray! Good, good. I love that there's an active component to my talk. So, that does appear to be something that we might practically take away. There's some research in this area, too, about the issue of de-individuation. There appears to be some support for it, but it's a psychological construct that we don't understand all that well. And it's a relatively new idea. It's interesting that there's that much agreement with that statement within the law enforcement community, though.
But technically, you would have to view a computer as a human being.
No.
I mean,
It's more the
deface a
media.
website, though.
Well, if we think about web defacement, sure, then
I mean, then you want responsibility for it almost.
to some degree, it's kind of a complex animal. If we think about person crimes, then it doesn't matter if there's a real person on the other end or not. When it comes to defacing a website, are we really physically impacting somebody aside from the security personnel within that agency?
Sure.
Depends on what you put on the
See,
site.
the stock stakeholders in the company, the people who own the stock, it's a publicly traded company.
Good.
If I go knock over the front page of Cisco.com, everyone who owns that is going to probably get pissed and maybe sell, or the stock will plummet.
And there's differential motive, too, that might factor in here. We didn't ask a lot about offender motivation, but that is an important point. The last point that has some value here, and I don't want to get derailed too soon, is the issue of computer hackers. So we asked two questions related to computer hacking. First and foremost, convicted hackers should be allowed to work in computing jobs. Most people disagreed with that statement. Same with convicted hackers should be allowed to have a computer at home. 86% disagreed with that statement as well. So when we think about some of the guidelines that are provided in terms of how we deal with convicted hackers, there's support for that in the law enforcement community at the local level. Yes?
Do you have an opinion on that? Because, I mean, that's tantamount to completely sabotaging your ability once you, let's say, get out of jail to earn a living. You know,
That's
like,
very true.
So if you were caught for chopping up cars, they're not going to say, oh, you can't work in an auto body shop.
Mm-hmm. It's a difficult question. On the one hand, there are certain offenses where we would definitely say computer use is going to be an issue. Like when we think about child porn or children's solicitation, gaining access to a computer where you might find others who support your behavior can totally negate some of the behavioral and cognitive therapies that are applied to deal with those behaviors. Because if you find a community that's supportive of it, that's going to totally demolish anything that's been done. When it comes to computer hacking, yes, there's benefits to having access to the technology. There are also some negatives that can result. How many of you have ever read the manual that's provided by the US DOJ about sentencing options when it comes to computer hacking? Very interesting document. I know some of you are well read, who knows? It touches on this issue as it relates to computer use and availability. And I think it's very dependent on the individual offender and what they've done. So I don't want to speak in general. I would just rather say sentencing guidelines are there for a reason, and hopefully they're appropriately applied, although there's some mix of that. We also asked individuals to rank where they put certain countries in terms of their threat of cyber attack. And so when we think about cyber terrorism or computer intrusions that are related to government and nation-state improvement, what countries spring to your minds?
Ukraine.
China and Russia, I heard Nigeria, although that's definitely a financial thing. India, potentially.
North Korea.
North Korea, possibly.
France.
We tried to, France has some problems too, yeah.
So maybe you'll touch on this. So your definition of a cyber terror attack, Brazil sends a crap ton of spam. Like there's like 80 bajillion people in Brazil, probably 70 bajillion computers, and like 60 bajillion are owned and sending out spam. So even though it could be somebody in Russia controlling the machines in Brazil, would you consider for this question the source would be Brazil or Russia in that case?
Now, we didn't get to the source issue. We touched on what countries, so we provided them with this list. Where would you rank these countries in terms of their threat of cyber attack?
Brazil.
So that could very well be. The list that we came up with, we tried to base in part on our general awareness of a country's national perspectives on cybercrime. We know that Brazil has a significant problem as it relates to spam, phishing, financial attacks, etc. China and Russia, there's oodles of reports about various attacks, Titan Rain, the Russian intrusions against various countries. But we also tried to introduce some controls with regard to different nations that might just fit into our general dynamic of terror, like Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Afghanistan. In terms of the capacity of Afghanistani hackers for cyber attacks, anybody think that's a significant and drastic threat? Generally speaking, we don't know. Our assumption would be that the pipes are relatively small in Afghanistan, so who knows? But we tried to provide some metric by which we could at least assess where these officers lie in terms of their country-level perspectives. So we asked them on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. These means give us a sense of where people fall in terms of the most significant threat. Good news, most state and local agencies put China as number 1. Given there's so much penetration within the media about China as a significant cyber threat for not only the US but other countries, that's a good thing. Seeing Russia up here is also good. Iran, though. Do we hear a lot about Iranian hackers? Not really. But there is some research to suggest that Iranian hackers are trying to actively engage in cyber attacks. They don't have the capacity to do it effectively, but they at least have the motivation to do it. So seeing them up here is not necessarily a bad thing or representative of a particular stereotype. Seeing Iraq, Japan, Afghanistan, and Egypt up here a little bit lower, again, not necessarily a bad thing, it just gives us some perspective. With regard to Romania, what do you always hear about Romania?
No laws.
No laws, lots of computer crime. Are they a carding-heavy nation? Definitely. Lots of financial materials being sold and distributed. It's a relatively safe haven for that kind of behavior. Brazil being ranked as the lowest threat overall is somewhat interesting, though. Yeah?
I was just wondering, how come you didn't put USA listed on there as well?
Good question. Why didn't we put the U.S. here? We tried to make this list just relatively inclusive of foreign nations. We didn't want to include the U.S. because we thought we're talking to law enforcement officials here at the state and local level, so we hoped they're already going to perceive individuals within their jurisdiction as a potential threat. So to include it again, we thought might be a little bit of overkill, or we might get some mixed messages in the results. But you're right, that is something that we need to consider, given that there are individuals in the U.S. who are still engaging in compromises. There are e-jihad sites that are hosted here in the U.S., which is scary in and of itself.
Or maybe terrorists living in our own country.
Possibly, yes. But we just try to keep this survey as simple as is possible, so that's why some of the metrics that are in here are here for a given reason. We also asked about the perceptions of crime writ large. So we asked questions about both physical offenses and computer-based offenses. And again, it's that 1 to 5 scale. So 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. There's some good things that fall out of this when we look at the means. So stealing something worth less than $5 is relatively less severe than other offenses. How many of you would agree with that? We're talking a candy bar or something small like that. Wireless theft comes in next. How many of you have ever done that? No one, sure. Interestingly, we see media piracy next. No one ever steals media. Nobody does that. So it's a relatively low threat. That's sensible, right? Stealing something worth more than $50 begins to broach our sort of midpoint at 3, followed by software piracy. Although, why do you think there might be software piracy given greater severity than media piracy? Any thoughts?
Cost more.
Cost more?
The name of business.
Possible. Greater business loss? Yeah.
Media is usually given out. Usually it's transited away from you, so they don't take it.
true. We can get CDs from a variety of different outlets. Hell, how many of you, well, probably not, but how many of you recall taping songs off of the radio? Remember that a long time ago? So, I mean, it's something that is relatively available. So that's an important point, sure. As we move further up the severity continuum, we see purposely damaging property. So this is asked both in terms of breaking into vehicles and buildings. This is sort of our midpoint. Followed by online harassment. So at 3.68, this is again getting a little bit more severe. Followed by breaking into a building or vehicle for theft, 3.82. Viewing data without permission is just slightly higher than breaking into a building or a vehicle for theft. What do you think about that?
What type of data?
Good question. What type of data? At a practical level, we didn't get into specifics about what type of data. We rather just said viewing data without permission from the individual owner. So this is at least something that might suggest, gosh, these two items are hanging together a little bit. So both a real-world crime and a computer-based crime appear to fall into some degree of similar severity. Now, sure, there are certain types of information that are much more dangerous and risky if they're released than others. But at least this is a unique kind of thing. Yeah.
So I'm guessing they didn't ask this crowd for their perception of this. Because I would think that would be lower if they asked this crowd.
That's a very good point. That's an excellent point. How many of you were here for the year that I actually tried to survey individual attendees at this conference? Given the high response rate of 19, I would love to ask these questions again. But the low turnout makes it somewhat less reliable than what we might have here. But that's a very good point. We're going to see differential attitudes based on the audience. Computer security professionals might rank these things drastically different. Even hackers, regardless of their ethical perspective, might rank these things differently. And that's a good point, given hitting somebody without any reason is just a little bit higher than viewing data without permission. Anybody ever take a swing at somebody when you're drunk? No? Any violent drunks in the crowd? It's always good to know in advance, just for the sake of argument. Good thing here, though, malware infections. So he specifically said viruses or other types of malicious software infections and distributions. This is over it's about 4.2% at the mean. So that means this is much more severe than our other infections. That's a good thing, right? If law enforcement agencies are able to see that, yes, having viruses spread across a network is bad, that's a good start. State and local agencies getting that is a good thing. Electronic theft of money being higher than malware, another good thing, we might say. Interesting that electronic theft of money, though, falls relatively just slightly below selling hard drugs such as heroin, cocaine, or methamphetamines. Why do you think there might be some convergence in those two items? Any thoughts?
Money to buy.
Steal money, get drugs.
Steal money, get drugs. There have been some news reports about the relationship between methamphetamine users and computer crime, which is surprising. Yeah?
It hits on a big thing that happens with law enforcement officers every day, and so they see that happening every day, and they see the effects of it, so they probably have some emotional attachment to that.
Excellent point. If we're talking about first responders, people who might have had a previous employment as a line officer or somebody who's going to a scene, regardless of what it might be, they might feel that there is some comparison between those two types of offenses. So that's very good.
Victim is hard to trace.
Victim is hard to trace. We could make the same argument here. Selling hard drugs, some people argue it's the fault of the buyer and not necessarily the seller. If the audience wants it, well, that's why I sell it. Electronic theft of money, we don't necessarily know who the victims are. We have an argument once a victim says this is what's happened. We don't know who the offender is. So there's some complexity in terms of those relationships. The last thing I want to point out, and since I'm really running over time, or at least running close, is that child porn and solicitation online. So we make this point specifically. Individuals who either obtain child pornography or solicit kids through some internet-based communication method is actually higher than both physical terror attacks and cyber terror attacks. Why do you think that might be?
Likelihood. There's more news coverage.
Likelihood? What else?
It's more specific.
It's an emotional response.
Yeah.
You know, like they have kids.
Good.
not rank that high.
Parents
So,
have nothing else to do.
given that this is a survey of law enforcement officers that you've already identified aren't specialists in computer security, they aren't specialists in digital forensics, you have to imagine that the reason anything cyber-related makes the top of the list at all has got to be driven through the media. They don't understand this. The reason they think it's valuable at all is we see it in the headlines all the time.
Now, an important point to mention, and I don't know if I made this clear enough at the beginning, all the individuals who responded have gone through computer crime or digital forensics training through the Law Enforcement Center. So while they might not necessarily be specialists, they've received some kind of advanced training over and above what one might receive at a police academy or otherwise. So it might be a consequence of sort of that emotional response to the problem. It could be any number of things. But that's a valid point that you do raise. I realize I've got like 2 minutes to wrap up. So since I don't want to derail the entire conference, but I'm glad. Quarter to? Good, I have 5 minutes. Well, let me know at the 2-minute mark and I'll push ahead as needed. We also asked about the frequency of computer crimes generally. Again, from a scale of, well, actually this time it was 1 to 6, 6 being the most frequent, 1 being never. All the responses are at least a 4 or higher at the mean level. So they think these things are happening regularly. So we have cyber or terror attacks falling at first. So sort of the least likely but happening regularly type of event. The bottom one here, being important, music piracy and software piracy fit the highest overall frequency. How many of you would agree with that? From the severity perspective? Very good point. We see this immediate change from the severity to the likelihood of the offense. Also, our child porn and solicitation falling up here just slightly below software piracy is a good point. Most agencies, again, are investigating different types of behaviors, and so if they're examining child porn cases on the regular, they might perceive this to be a more frequent offense. What do we know about software piracy and music piracy generally? Do most people, regardless of age, demographic characteristics, or otherwise, engage in some forms of piracy?
Yes.
Practically speaking, yes, there's a lot of people who do. So that might be part of what's driving this. Finally, I think I probably have time for this. We asked individuals to rank their awareness of the meaning of different terms. Good. So we asked them about different technical terms as well as different types of computer crime. Starting with firewalls, cookies, spyware, adware. Thankfully, most people seem to have some idea of what that term means. Firewall, cookies, spyware. A little lower on adware, but at least that's a good sign, right? There's some recognition of what those events are. Spam, high response rate here. Why do you think podcasts might be a little bit lower than even adware, though?
Most people don't know what.
It's not a crime.
It's not a
If
crime.
you don't have an iPod.
Good, if you don't have an iPod. That's a very important point. You might not know what the hell a podcast is if you don't have an iPod. We see good penetration on the issue of viruses, spam, a little bit less on phishing, and very low response overall on carding. What's carding?
Credit card fraud.
Credit card fraud, sale and distribution of stolen personal financial information. Why do you think that might be so low?
It's not normally called carding.
It's
Doesn't
very
happen in this
rarely
country.
done at a local and state level, investigated at the
Might not necessarily refer to as carding. Also not often investigated at the state and local
Eastern
level.
Europe, it happens in there, not necessarily here.
Good. The offenders are living abroad, so the likelihood of state and local agencies dealing with this is pretty low. Most of the investigations we've seen related to carding, like Operation Firewall, were conducted by the Secret Service and the FBI. So carding is not an issue at the state and local level. Wow, I've really sucked up a lot of time just on the national level survey that we've conducted. There's some great stuff that we have about a nearby policing agency here in North Carolina that should you be interested in, please let me know. I'll be happy to share that with you. We also had this stuff that I was going to get to, but I got too busy conversing otherwise. So please feel free to hit me up later. I'll be happy to share what we've got. At a practical level, what's the takeaway here? Well, state and local agencies conduct a number of investigations related to financial crimes and to a lesser extent sex crimes, but the hacking and intrusion cases aren't there. There seems to be some recognition of basic technology issues, so they seem to know what firewalls are, what their utility is, but as we push out into some broader issues, it's not necessarily there. Officer issues also appear to conform to some general research that's been conducted with regard to attitudes toward computer crime. People have been surveyed in the general population concerning whether or not hackers should be allowed to have access to computers, either whether as a consequence of their job or at home. Most people say don't give them access. There's some mixed response on the international factor, but the good thing is that they seem to state that people in their community don't understand computer crime. That at least tells us law enforcement seems to have some comprehension of the problem, but not necessarily so at a broader level. How many of you would agree with that? People outside of a conference like this aren't going to get it. Yeah? Okay, well good. The issue related to both computer offending and real-world offending, seeing some similarities here based on severity, it's very interesting. We haven't looked at this at a practical level as criminologists and criminal justice practitioners. We often segment these behaviors. But it's important that we begin to address how those two things sync up. Is there any relationship? And what does that point to at a broader level? Let me just bump to the end. If you have any questions, you can feel free to email me, holt@msu.edu. Go Spartans tonight in March Madness. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I love that I actually got to open the con this year. That means a lot to me. You all are like a second family, so I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions, fire away. I think I might have a minute, maybe. Nothing? Well, very good. Then I'll turn it over to our lead man. And thank you all for coming.
I hope I don't make the speakers go all that shit crazy. Is Deviant around? All right, cool. Because I don't want to stand here and entertain people for an hour. It would probably involve me getting naked or something.
Not entertaining.
Not necessarily.
Well, my options are stand near the speaker and make everybody go deaf, or stand right here and make myself go blinder.
We're actually going to open up the other side.
Okay. Yeah, all right. So we got a couple minute break. We're going to open up this wall here. Apparently we have a lot of people. Couple minutes.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Go get a beer. Be back in 10 minutes.
I think that we should. Yeah, we set the scene.
Yeah,
We already have that They told me not to let you guys do that.
Yeah, it's probably you.
Well, Right. We're going to open this wall up.
So, how you doing, man?
Pretty good.
Nice call.
Yes, sir.